Now, I want to offer you 3 building blocks for trying to understand what China is like, just as a beginning. The first is this, that China is not really a nation state. Okay, it's called itself a nation state for the last 100 years. But anyone knows anything about China knows it's a lot older than this. This was what China looked with the victory of the Qin dynasty in 221 BC at the end of the Warring State period, the birth of modern China. And you can see it against the boundaries of modern China. Or immediately afterwards, the Han dynasty, still 2,000 years ago, and you can see already it occupies most of what we now know as Eastern China, which is where the vast majority of Chinese lived then and lived now. Now, what is extraordinary about this is what gives China its sense of being China? What gives the Chinese the sense of what it is to be Chinese comes not from the last 100 years, not from the nation-state period, which is what happened in the West, but from the period, if you like, of the civilization state. I'm thinking here, for example, of customs like ancestral worship, of a very distinctive notion of the state, likewise a very distinctive notion of the family, social relationships like Guanxi, Confucian values, and so on. These are all things that come from the period of the civilization state. In other words, China, unlike the Western states and like most countries in the world, is shaped by its sense of civilization, its existence as a civilization state, rather than as a nation state. And there's one other thing to add to this, and that is this. Of course, we know China's big, huge, demographically and geographically, with a population of 1.3 billion people. What we often don't really are aware of is the fact that China is extremely diverse and very pluralistic, and in many ways very decentralized. You can't run a place on this scale simply from Beijing, even though we think this to be the case. It's never been the case. So this is China, a civilization state rather than a nation state. Well, what does it mean? Well, I think it has all sorts of profound implications. I'll give you 2 quick ones. The first is that the most important political value for the Chinese is unity, is the maintenance of Chinese civilization. 2,000 years ago, Europe broke down the fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire. It divided, and it's remained divided ever since. China, over the same time period, went in exactly the opposite direction, very painfully holding this huge civilization state together. The second is maybe more prosaic, which is Hong Kong. Do you remember the handover of Hong Kong by Britain to China in 1997? You may remember what the Chinese constitutional proposition was. 1 country, 2 systems. And I'll lay a wager that barely anyone in the West believed them. Window dressing. When China gets its hands on Hong Kong, that won't be the case. 13 years on, the political and legal system in Hong Kong is as different now as it was in 1997. We were wrong. Why we were wrong? We were wrong because we thought, naturally enough, in nation-state ways. Think of German unification, 1990. What happened? Well, basically the East was swallowed by the West. 1 nation, 1 system. That is the nation-state mentality. But you can't run a country like China, a civilization state, on the basis of 1 civilization, 1 system. It doesn't work. So actually, the response of China to the question of Hong Kong, as it will be to the question of Taiwan, was a natural response. 1 civilization, many systems. Let me offer you another building block to try and understand China, maybe not sort of comfortable one. The Chinese have a very, very different conception of race to most other countries. Do you know, of the 1.3 billion Chinese, over 90% of them think they belong to the same race, the Han. Now, this is completely different from the other world's most populous countries. India, the United States, Indonesia, Brazil. All of them are multiracial. The Chinese don't feel like that. China is only multiracial, really, at the margins. So the question is why? Well, the reason, I think, essentially is again, back to the civilization state. Very, very, a history of at least 2,000 years. A history of conquest, occupation, absorption, assimilation, and so on, led to the process by which, over time, this notion of the Han emerged, of course, nurtured by a growing and very powerful sense of cultural identity. Now, the great advantage of this historical experience has been that without the Han, China could never have held together. The Han identity has been the cement which has held this country together. The great disadvantage of it is that the Han have a very weak conception of cultural difference. They really believe in their own superiority, and they are disrespectful of those who are not, hence their attitude, for example, to the Uyghurs and to the Tibetans. Or let me give you my third building block, the Chinese state. Now, the relationship between the state and society in China is very different from that in the West. Now, we in the West overwhelmingly seem to think these days, at least, that the authority and legitimacy of the state is a function of democracy. The problem with this proposition is that the Chinese state enjoys more legitimacy and more authority amongst the Chinese than is true with any Western state. And the reason for this is because, well, there are two reasons, I think. And it's obviously got nothing to do with democracy, because in our terms, the Chinese certainly don't have a democracy. But the reason for this is, firstly, because the state in China is given a very special, enjoys a very special significance as the representative, the embodiment, and the guardian of Chinese civilization, of the civilization state. This is as close as China gets to a kind of spiritual role. And the second reason is because, whereas in Europe and North America, the state's power is continuously challenged, I mean, in European tradition, historically against the church, against other sections of the aristocracy, against merchants and so on, for 1,000 years, the power of the Chinese state has not been challenged. It's had no serious rivals. So you can see that the way in which power has been constructed in China is very different from our experience in Western history.